I'd like to present Dr. Ileana Rodriquez, who is a distinguished professor emeritus in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the Ohio State University. She has published extensively on Latin American and Central American literature and cultural production. Her current work is on the intersection of aesthetics, memory, and politics. Her talk today is called Writing Affect, Trembling Before Oneself and Others.
Okay, my title is Writing Affect, Trembling Before Oneself and Others. This conference is the culmination of an enlightening and very generative seminar that brought together approaches to memory and trauma as studied by neuroscience and psychoanalysis organized by Professors Ana Forcinito and Ofelia Ferran. I greatly profited by the experience, and I am very thankful to the organizers for letting me in. Thank you. This paper is my own approach to what I have learned. My entry point to the discussion is Kathy Caruth's paper entitled Literature in the Ashes of History, in which she speaks about the coalescence of event, trauma, repetition, and history. The centerpiece of her reading Freud through Derrida is terror and the imminence of death that produces in Freud the concept of death instinct, and in Derrida the notion of the archive of evil, which introduces the conjunction of history and politics into trauma. Caruth's simultaneous reading of both allows the recording and writing of history as, quote, a psychic as well as a technical procedure that participates not only in its remembering, but also in its forgetting, unquote. Laying over the notion of archive, the inscription of the event within a repetitive flux of interpretation further complicates the issue. But repetition is key to understanding a return to the event as the archaic original, a type of archaeological excavation searching for that lost object memory accounts for or not. Memories that could not be remembered, interrupted and erased memories, like those of war-producing traumas representing terror before the imminence of death, visible in the body nonetheless. For Derrida, Freud's archaeological search of the unconscious through the trace becomes the constitution of the historical archive. However much it dissimulates, destroys, prohibits, and diverts through interpretation, force, or both, it nonetheless reveals an absolute desire for memory, to return to the past that in its same act of interpretation always repeats the way in which the past has been erased. Hence the question, what does it mean for history to be a history of ashes? Focusing on one point does not render justice to Caruth's magnificent piece, but it does allow me to introduce affect as the centerpiece of my sample. A theory of affect brings us close to an understanding of these tangled articulations, for which I read Catherine Malabou's work. Her text, Go Wonder, Subjectivity and Affect in the Neurobiological Times, I read it by curiosity and dive deep into what I understand is the networking that embraces sciences and humanities in new conceptions of affect, making the brain the fulcrum of a new libidinal economy. I read it under the allure produced by the entangling of philosophy, psychoanalysis, and neurobiology, and come under the spell of Malabou's reading of philosophy, turning it totally comprehensible and relational. I read it too because the idea of flexibility and malleability, the possibility of rerouting paths taking us to remembering and forgetting, both memory modalities, are treated as an economy, a term which gives me pause when attached to libido and to the brain as emotional. I stand in awe on the threshold of a new proposal over the understanding of affects, an approach to emotions, passions, and feelings, perhaps a deconstruction or reconstitution of subjectivity as a physiology, a body that feels before it thinks, that by means of which, as Deleuze upholds, Spinoza sustains, quote, the body's power of activity is increased or diminished, assisted or checked, together with the ideas of these affections, unquote. Affect is that which modifies, alters, and changes the body's animal spirits. It is the impact of an encounter that creates not a cognitive phenomenon, but an emotional one, without having it touch the logical structures, but only, quote, the very feelings of existence, unquote. Such encounter comes forcefully to bear on the very fibers of being, immanent and intuitive, and makes the body quiver, the eye tear, breathing heave, and turn into a sob or a deep sigh, surges up the heat, the heartbeat, body actions, quote, related to feelings of existence itself, modifications produced by the feeling of difference, unquote. Okay. Ideas that for me weigh heavily on the political, and that's my point. I am receptive to this formulation of affect that later on will be argued as auto-affect, a feeling of self as other, or like hetero-affect, a primordial self profoundly alien to oneself, a self aesthetic awakes, provoking spontaneous visceral reactions. I have experienced it myself when reading, hearing, seeing something that moves me, immediately quieting me down, the knot on my throat smothering my voice, bringing tears to my eyes and crumpling my face. Such I experienced privately and publicly when showing the scene I analyze here from Marcela Zamora's film Los Ofendidos, a film whose intention is the gathering of information, the visual rendering of testimonies from subjects crossing over El Salvador's political grid in the 1980s. The background is a daughter's search for the meaning of her father's life. Rubén Zamora, a notorious political leader in El Salvador during that era. The child's desire frames her series of interviews. I single out one to illustrate what Malabou says Heidegger called auto-affect, the coming into contact with oneself, which is, quote, the origin of all other kinds of affects, passions, emotions, and feelings. Auto-affection appears to be the basis, the condition of possibility of the primary and primordial form of every particular affect. Feelings are only possible because the very core of ourself is primarily auto-affected. Auto-affection designates the very feeling of existence, the very structure of subjectivity. We are at a Central American home of open wrapping porches exposed to the air, sun, and warmth of tropical weather, with a hammock lackadaisically hanging up, inviting us to rest, a small garden in flower across, sitting there to listen to a story to be told, a return to the event as the archaic original. This is what is called belatedness, a movement implying opposite directions, messing up the temporal line, pointing into the presence of an event whose memory has been quieted down, the message buried, its inscription an enigma, translated temporarily, and therefore becoming trauma afterwards. Central to memory processes is the notion of burial and the figure of archaeological digging, as in testimonial literature, a hide-and-seek hermeneutical game, now bringing up, now skewing terror. Returning is key to finding both event and its interpretation. The feeling of emotional distension, trust, and expectancy in the midst of this Arcadian place has a contention mandate: thou shalt not cry. Perhaps this mandate lies in the nature of the gathering of selves, perhaps on the presence of a subject about to publicly open his heart to us, the sacred nature of the private. Emotions belong to the most intimate in us, to that unique contact with ourselves when we are alone, philosophically expressed in the notion of auto-affect. The will to contention is there, but emotions, we know, run rampant and become visible in our facial expressions, our dry tongue that insists on sticking to the palate in spite of the speaker's effort to remain demure and distended, calm and serene, to be soft, his gaze looking afar, to gather strength while he navigates his inner self, hands over his lap in rest, pushing index against index and thumb against thumb, as if for keeping himself in equilibrium, or touching his head as in a caress to lighten up the heaviness of the story. Our desire for memory is not to betray, to hold on, to be strong. The gesture brings up memories of a musical virtuoso playing the violin. But then, little by little, slowly, the internal force of passion bypasses all efforts of the speaking subject, and it is not only the tongue that dries out in his mouth, but also a throat spasm, the quavering of words, the difficulty of breathing as if gasping for air, until the scene becomes dead silent. Words are muted, and only the muscle stands in an uncontrollable contortion, taking over fully the camera close-up. This is when we, the public, begin to feel exactly the same symptoms, when we are affected by the other outside or inside ourselves, that unknown self to oneself we carry within Malabú's hetero-affect. I will speak of the testimonial rendered by Dr. Juan Romagosa. Coming up belatedly, such event takes the form of an enigma, calling for interpretation at a new phase of the subject's development, when neither event nor person are the same. This is what is called deferred action, the pathogenic effect manifesting itself retrospectively, implying repression, emergence, and interpretation, as in literary flow of consciousness. It is as if the event was submerged, present but not remembered, or not remembered as such, but remembered only through its possible interpretation. In this logic, the timeline fuses temporalities, past, present, and future, in an avant-garde style of literature. Returning turns into what Caruth says Derrida signifies in speaking about the archive of evil that not only leaves an imprint, but also their censorship and repression, quote, history not available for immediate consciousness access. Yet, Romagosa's narrative seems simple and follows the expected linear path. I did this, they did that. This is reason organized in the story. His body will say otherwise. He tells us how he begins going to rallies and healing the wounded, how he's captured, taken in a bus to a helicopter, tied to the helicopter's door, and while in the air, the soldiers swing open the door to scare him. We're going to throw you down, they say. He is first taken to El Paraíso garrison and then transferred to San Salvador's National Guard, where he's locked up in a room in the same building where Colonel Carlos Eugenio Vides Casanova's office is located. This is the introit to the story, its context. But bit by bit, the genre changes and a political narrative turns into a horror story of torture, which at the beginning, in principle, follows the same format. Generally, they inform actions to inflict pain and violate the body's sacrality and intimacy in an impeccable syntax. Torture is rape. But on the crevices of speech, following a grammatical script, we intuitively notice the subject glosses over what the body feels, a suffering repressed and postponed, the memory erased or interrupted. Here and there, in a pause denoting a confusion and elision, the archive of evil pops up. Hiatus and ellipses begin turning narrative into poetry, that which is not heard, narrated or written, terror unspoken warehouse, what could not be said or heard, history not readily available to consciousness, we suspect. Dr. Juan Romagosa was captured in 1980 in Chalatenango while assisting patients at the Santa Anita Church Clinic. He was interrogated 3 or 4 times a day. Electric shocks were applied to his body. His skin was burned with cigarettes, and he was sexually raped with an instrument. Did you hear me? He also was hung by his fingers and left hanging during 5 to 6 hours, tied with wires, which rendered impossible for good to practice surgery. He was isolated from his affective environment, family, newly born daughter, and hit with hands, instruments, and more importantly, with words. In this belief, we hear the human horror enunciated with the best kept composure. His narrative begins growing in us, and we begin to be tortured alongside him. It all starts with a sigh, a hiatus we cannot help but hear, for it cuts out his phrasing and closes his throat, his and our throats in a rhythmic spasm. Soon, the speaking man raises his head as if to look afar in an attempt to defer action, avoiding the public gaze, but the camera insists on focusing on him relentlessly. His ignominy, his shame overtakes us while he bears out his soul in front of us, inviting to partake his intimacy, that which we hold dear, the most precious we keep to ourselves, as much in pleasure as in pain. The narrator dabbles little in detail. Details are intuited when we see him hardly swallowing his own saliva, taking his fingers pads to his head, or pointing with his index the place where the wire cut him up, the phalange still keeping the trace of the injury, the fingernail pointing to the wound in the left arm they damaged for being a lefty. At this point of the story, the man breathes deeply, heaves as if gasping for air, sighing, while his placid smile turns into a grimace, betraying a severely contained pain, the imminence of death, and with an ironic smile repeats the speech given to him regarding the wealth he could have amassed had he not been roaming around curing the undeserving. Porch and body become blurred as the lens focuses on the head moving from side to side, signaling the man's distress, as if to hush away hostile thoughts while his fingers roam around his head, and with the finger pads he gently strokes himself right on camera, remembering the blows suffered, our eyes unrelentingly focusing on him, following him up close. Suddenly, a close-up of his skull vanishes all context while a cello begins to play grieving accords. In my head, I hear Arvo Pár's Credo, which keeps me company as musical background while I write this piece. But part is not the music played by the instrument hugging the image on the screen. The man's phrases falter and become more and more fragmented, stumbling and stammering in poetic cadence, hesitant and tripping, staggering, tentative, awkward, as the pause between the phrases is elongated in a confusing stuttering. We can now see him thrown blindfolded on the floor when Vides Casanova, the torture lord himself, arrives, and while admonishing and reprimanding him, he kicks him hard. The man conveys that while curing a worm-infected finger, they threw the worms to his chest. Eat them, eat them. The air contained in a long sigh breaks into a sob. Now his words are imperceptible, almost a murmur, like chorus voices, like wind cloistered in the large and high ogives of a Gothic cathedral. He's weeping, bleeding inside, his throat spasm audible. The hardest thing was to leave his country, he says it sweetly, in a hush, while he begins to bite his lips, and the movie director off camera begins to sob, and with her, we. And then she says, I no longer know what to ask you. The man bends his head. This is the hour of the Agnus Deus, the passing of the angel that looks back in horror. History, the history of ashes. These 45 filmic seconds seem eternal, and then he raises his head. The distance between us is erased. We become one while the intrusive camera lingers on and the director's sob becomes film soundtrack. The experience archive. I am so sorry, he says. The session is closed. The old man's presence sacred, reflecting on what they could not take away, almost inaudibly, moment of wonder, his primordial affect and ours fused together without oppositions or contradictions, the soul at rest. The point is, says Malabou, Descartes upholds, wonder is previous to judgment. There is no judgment in wonder. Wonder is pure opening, acceptance of the extraordinary as alterity, a silent and striking passion that imposes stillness on the body, as if the novelty and strangeness of objects and of the world in general is reflecting the beauty and extraordinary presence of the soul. It's mirroring and reflection in the brain. It defies the philosophical disposition as a passion raised by the sameness between spirit and the world. And this is precisely the point. We are overtaken by the marked stillness of generosity, open to the stupefaction of the world, its marvelousness. Generosity, states Malabou, repeating the card, is a kind of auto effect. A basic form of respect and recognition of valor and key to a virtuous life. In the case of the interviewed doctor, wonder comes at the time of forgiving, when he tells us that he met with his torturer and talks about their friendship, his feelings that he was never at peace with himself, and he tells us in the back part of his house, that which we in Central America we call yard, not garden, but dried earth, perhaps planted with fruit trees. The opposite of wonder is consternation. Quote, because wonder at an evil keeps a mind so paralyzed in regarding it alone that it is incapable of thinking of other things, whereby he might avoid of evil. Through the camera lens, we contemplate the beauty and serenity of the sea. While I was writing this piece, I was listening to Arvo Part's Credo. Written in 1960, this musical piece is a sonorous continuum of voices murmuring a prayer in a cathedral. The sound potentiated by the church's acoustics. His author tells us that the composition was inspired by the central idea of Christianity that predicated we must love our enemies, and that such peace comprises two opposing worlds, one inspired by forgiveness and the other by revenge. Forgiving and resentment are opposing forces, constructive one, destructive the other. This eventually leads to its destruction. We must approach evil with love. This is what this man's moral and final point of the story. Love your enemy is the limiting expression of heteroaffect, which breaks all the barriers of reason. I'm finishing. In this filmic reconstruction of an instant in the political history of El Salvador, Marcela Zamora produces in images such perceptions, and we find this as much in the soft gaze of her father, looking lovingly at his daughter, making a film about his own life, telling her his own story after his wife has passed on. Thank you.